Good morning, my brothers and sisters. Welcome to episode number 41 and be with me in the book of Hebrews, chapter 11. We're going to look today at a story about Abraham almost sacrificing Isaac. Remember that faith is how we consider, how we think about God in a world before we see the promises of God come true. So today we're going to ask, how did Father Abraham consider God? What did he think about God to successfully live out and pass, if you will, a test that the Lord gave him? So he passed this test by how he thought about God, how he considered God, and how he had faith in certain abilities of God. Specifically, Abraham had faith that God was able even to raise Isaac from the dead before he saw it. It's the central element in Abraham's faith. And the question we're going to ask about us eventually is, do we have this same faith before we see it? That is, the resurrection. Do we have faith in the ability of God to raise Jesus from the dead? And in a sense, every believer has to participate in the sacrifice of a father to a son as we are put to the test and prove our faith in a very similar way that Abraham was. So here's how we get started. Our official verse is from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17 through 19. I'll read that now. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, his son, whom he had received the promises. Offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered, this is Abraham considered, he thought about God. Abraham considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So this recalls a story from Genesis 22 when Abraham he grabs the knife, kills his most precious son. Before the promises of this heritage, of this numerically stars in the sky, sand of the sea, descendants would be seen. And in fact, the grand total of his descendants at that point was 1, and he was going to make it 0. So we have to ask, what was he thinking? Well, the New Testament helps us understand the Old Testament because we find out another aspect of what Abraham was thinking. So back in Genesis 22, God tested Abraham, so God was involved in this process. It was verbally commanded by God, and he said to go offer him as a burnt offering. So he rises early the next morning, in the morning, chops the wood, and then, in a picture sort of way, lays the wood upon his son. Lays the wood of his own sacrifice upon his shoulders, and Isaac. But all the while saying God will provide the lamb for a burnt offering. And at the critical moment, he takes him up there, binds him, and then he reaches out his hand and takes the knife. And then an angel comes and says, don't lay your hand upon him. I know you fear the Lord. I know you value the Lord. And I see that you have not withheld your son, which is what the Father does in the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus as well. And then he reiterates the promise that he gave him in a couple of chapters before that in your offspring all nations will be blessed. So then in Hebrews chapter 11, which I just read earlier, we find out that Abraham considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, that God was able to raise Jesus from the dead, that God was even able to raise Isaac from the dead, and the promise could still come through Isaac even though he had been sacrificed. So this amazing act of faith that Abraham does is very similar to the act of faith that all of us have to do. So Abraham has to go through this mental process and understand that God is the author of life and God is the answerer of promises. And God said to sacrifice, yes, and he also said that these promises were going to come true through Isaac. And he combines these two almost impossible things together and says, okay, he's going to be sacrificed, but then God is going to raise him up from the dead. So he understands something about God being the author of life and God being a promise keeper. So Abraham has faith he considers God in a certain way, and he knows the person of God before he sees all these future things happen, before he was even saw somebody raised from the dead. So faith is the trust in the person of God, and here we see in the abilities of God before the promises of God are evident. So Abraham trusts in the abilities of God as author of life before that promise would be evident, before it's manifest. So what kind of a father would allow his son to be killed? Well, a father that knew his son was coming back to life. So remember that God gives some insight into the Father. It allows us this insight into God the Father, allowing the crucifixion of God the Son and the resurrection of God the Son. So this junior version of father-son combo, that is Abraham, Isaac, that doesn't have to go through with it, gives us some insight into a superior father-son combo, that is the Father, God the Son combo, that did have to go through with it. So what kind of a father would take a son where he would not want to go and put wood of his own sacrifice upon his back and bind him in a way that he did not want to be bound and be willing to see him sacrificed? Well, that's God. The story of God the Father. So how did Abraham consider God? Well, he considered him in a certain way to successfully live out this particular test. And Abraham passes the test by how he considers God, how he thought. And we have to admire how he had faith in the abilities of God, specifically even to raise from the dead. And that is before he saw that, before his faith became sight. Similarly, every believer has to have this same faith before we see it. That is in the resurrection of Jesus. Every believer has to participate mentally here in this sacrifice of a father to son and believe that there's ability of God to raise this son. So our faith, similarly to Abraham, is put to the test, and we have to prove our faith in the same way Abraham did. Do we believe that God is able even to raise from the dead? I hope you have that faith today. Thanks for listening.